Okay, good afternoon. My name is Angus Kennedy from the Institute of Ideas. I also chair the Institute of Ideas Economy Forum, which has been discussing these issues for, well, forever really, given that this one is capitalism, kill or cure, is sort of the big question in some ways. I don't need to give too much of an introduction to the subject matter. There continue to be popular cries to throw the money changers out of the temple. Occupy St. Paul's was back just last Sunday. The TUC are marching through London today, focusing against austerity and against the abuses of the financial system. The whole of Greece is on strike again. And Karl Marx may be dead, but you really wouldn't know it when you read a lot of the literature and discussion, which is kind of very long-faced and gloomy about, I told you this capitalism wouldn't work. Look what we've come to now. And so the basic idea for this session is to look at whether or not the problem that we are facing, both economically and politically, is a surplus or a deficit of capitalism today. That is, should we let it rip, let the animal spirits fly and increase competitiveness, or is the problem that there actually hasn't been enough regulation and control? It's all been rather too free and too easy with my money and yours. So to introduce my panel then, on my left, who'll be speaking first, Ferdinand Mount, just written a book called The New Few, or A Very British Oligarchy, which I read a couple of weeks ago. I think it is very informative, puts its finger on a lot of things that should be fingered, if I'm allowed to say that in public. He's the former editor of the TLS and was head of the Prime Minister's Policy Unit from 1982 to 1984. Speaking after him, on my immediate right, I haven't quite finished Vicky Price's new book, Greekonomics, but I've only got about 10 pages to go. Well worth a read to find out what's going on, not just in Greece, but in the euro as a whole, what's holding it together and what's driving it apart. She's a city economist, a former joint head of the Government Economic Services, and co-founder of GoodCorporation. Third to speak, on my far left, is Mike Short. He's the Senior Vice President of Industry Affairs at SABMiller, one of the headline partners for today, and it's very good of you to come and join us, Mike. And finally to speak, Phil Mullan, who's an economist and Business Transformation Director of EasyNet Global Services, author of The Imaginary Time Bomb, and working on a new book at the moment about the politics, the economics of muddle through, and how long can that last, which I suppose is what we're here to discuss. Let's thank the panel at the end, but Ferdy, would you kick us off?
What alarming alternative pictures we're being presented with this afternoon, as Angus has just outlined. On the one hand, unbridled capitalism dripping with the blood of innocence and crying out for bridles, snaffles and breaks, and a huge re-education program for company directors on a scale which even Comrade Mao would have blenched at. On the other hand, we have the terminally enfeebled capitalism, barely able to stagger on, shackled by the grim regulators, castrated by the commissars of health and safety, its practitioners scarcely able to drag their property off to the Isle of Man or Monaco in order to avoid the punitive taxes, and sadly lacking in those animal spirits that Angus referred to, which you need to unleash the creative gale of destruction, which Schumpeter said was the way things changed and improved in capitalist society. It's a dramatic either-or, and I'm afraid we'll have to exercise extreme clemency if I don't come down on one side or the other, but rather duck off down an alternative path which I hope will help to illuminate both sides of the argument. Because I think it's basically a false antithesis. In fact, I think it might benefit both our social and economic debates if we gave the word capitalism a rest for a bit. It wasn't actually Marx who first coined it, it was Thackeray and the Newcomes a few years earlier. But it was Marx and Engels too who gave it an extra life as the overarching reality of our times and left it to weigh on us like a great black lump, and they reified it, to use an ugly verb which actually the Marxists were the first to leap on. But really a society in which government spends or redistributes more than 40% of GDP can't really be said to be a red-blooded, thoroughgoing capitalist society. Unfunded public expenditure, which is most public expenditure, is not the stuff of capitalism, and our debate reflects that, since so much of it is about how to spend that money on schools and hospitals and how to organize them and so on. And on the other side, it's hard to argue that present-day Britain is completely drained of entrepreneurial spirit. Statistics show that more people than ever before are eager to start up their own businesses. The majority of the bigger companies are reporting pretty good profits. More people are employed than ever before. A lot of them half-time, that's true, but still it's quite an impressive figure. And London remains the financial capital of the world even after the shenanigans of the past 4 years. As for the supposed extinction of manufacturing industry, well, the UK is going to be producing more cars next year than for a generation at least. So we can argue about the collapse of the banks and its causes. Was it because they were allowed to grow too big to fail? Or is it because the government had implicitly given them a guarantee that they would be bailed out? Too regulated or not regulated enough? I'm not going to go into those arguments now, except to say that for centuries, banking has been recognized, both in Britain and the US and on the continent, as different from other enterprises because the collapse of a major bank impacts on the whole economy. Like the flow of water or electricity, the flow of money needs special protection if a society is to carry on. Another word I want to avoid is neoliberal. Except as a term of abuse, which it's had a very good innings at, I don't think it really got that much practical purpose or purchase. It certainly doesn't have much to do with the teachings of Adam Smith. In fact, the trouble with most so-called neoliberals is that not that they've read too much Adam Smith, but they've read too little. In fact, they've only read The Wealth of Nations, and they haven't read the theory of moral sentiments, which explains the sympathies which bind us together as communities. But what I wanted to do very quickly is to analyze our present ills in terms of a much older idea, which is the idea of contract. So many human engagements take the form of a contract, especially engagements with strangers. A contract may be implicit or explicit, may be written down or handed down, it may be legal or it may be a moral one. It may be complicated, it may be a matter of a simple handshake. And there are contracts to provide pretty well everything in life: marriage, water, military service, house rental, anything you can think of. And in industry and commerce, the contract is not only the standard form, literally speaking, but compliance with its terms is the great growth industry of our time. In fact, it's providing employment for an army of lawyers, which seems to be growing as fast as our armed services are shrinking. So what I want to argue is that a great number of the scandals and smashes of the past few years aren't due to a disgusting excess of capitalism or to a disabling deficiency of it. They're simply due to individuals and corporations breaking their engagements, their contracts with either their customers, their shareholders, their suppliers, or indeed the public more generally. I mean, the most simple example is that when we entrusted, as we have for centuries, our savings to a high street bank, we do so for safekeeping, plus a little interest. We are not offering up those savings as a security for a gigantic gambling spree. Similarly, if we invest in a new company and 5 years later we haven't received a penny in dividends and our investment is worth a tenth of what it was, and meanwhile the executives have all somehow mysteriously accumulated huge pension pots and bonuses and private jets and the rest of it, that suggests a disregard of the implicit contract between shareholders and managers at the outset of the founding of the firm. In many cases, to put it bluntly, the managers have looted the company. Again, if you take your local monopoly supplier of water, what you expect is when you connect up is that you're not only going to get a supply of clean water, but you're not going to have hosepipe bans every time the sun shines, while the executives waltz away with huge rewards. Is it legitimate that the managers of unit trusts and pension funds should continue to award themselves massive pay rises while the value of funds under management either stays stagnant or actually decreases? Does the steward, and this I think is a fundamental question, does the steward of assets deserve to be rewarded as handsomely as the entrepreneur who created those assets? Because on that logic, the man who drives the bullion van ought to be paid on the same scale as the CEO of a big mining company which dug up the gold. So I'm just talking really about not the breaches of regulation, but the breaches of trust, the refusal to honor the rules and understandings. And if those rules are to work in practice, as we're now beginning to understand, they must be clear and transparent, and the actors in the market must be properly accountable. And in public companies, for example, we're all beginning to understand, and the shareholder spring was the first real public flowering of that understanding, that the shareholders must be able to exercise effective control over the level of those rewards. Pension funds and asset managers have to fulfill and understand their fiduciary duties to the people whose money they manage. They are the middlemen, and their duty is to represent their customers. So how do we make this happen? Well, there's three ways. You can have laws like Vince Cable's law to make the veto legal. You can have new stewardship codes, but most of all, and this is really what I want to leave you with, is the idea that you can have a behavioral change in which people in business generally just develop a clear moral understanding of the implicit contract they are in with their customers, their suppliers, their shareholders, and their staff. That may sound like a remote and fanciful idea, but it happened before. It happened in the 1930s when the behavior of corporations and the people who ran them changed and changed for a generation. It can happen again. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's excellent start to get us going. Vicky.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting just listening to this, as there is one contract in particular which is bothering quite a lot of people in Europe, and that is their perceived social contract with the government, which seems to be completely eroded by the very substantial declines in GDP they have found, the structural changes that they've had to impose on their countries over a very short period of time. And it is interesting that, of course, it's going to get worse before it gets better. So we're debating capitalism at a time where, in fact, the global economy is not doing very well at all, and some parts in Europe in particular are suffering hugely. If you look at the latest IMF report, the World Economic Forum, Economic Outlook, which has just come out, one of the models is actually putting the probability of a recession in the Eurozone at 80%, which is very substantial. Already we're having a decline 1 year, and we may actually have a further decline next year if things don't improve, with some countries suffering the 5th year of decline, if not 6th by that time, like Greece. But also Spain and Italy are getting into that game as well. So we are really talking about a serious look at what government can do in this. The UK itself is now likely to see a decline in GDP for the year overall for 2012 and maybe a small improvement in 2013, which actually is pretty bad news. Yes, unemployment is not doing that badly, but remember, a lot of it is part-time. Women have lost out very significantly. Most people would like to have long-term jobs. And people are turning to the government. So is the way in which things are managed right now a sensible one for the longer term or not? And it seems to me that when we're talking about the role of the government, it's not just the amount of money that it spends. It is very, very significant. If you look down at the FTSE 100, you will see that the vast majority of the firms that are in there are coming under some sort of government supervision. They're either directly controlled, if it's the financial sector, through regulation. They are subject to competition requirements, such as, let's say, supermarkets, the ones you would think perhaps are not directly under control, and yet they have to abide to all sorts of rules. They perhaps are the sort of firms from which the government procures, and therefore they have to behave in a certain way. And if you look at the growth of pharmaceuticals, defense, and so on, that has been at the back of very strong government buying. You have the accountants, regulators, and so on, who, of course, are very heavily involved additionally on behalf of the government in ensuring, or as self-regulators, in ensuring that standards are, in fact, kept. And you have a myriad of regulations which are imposed on health and safety in terms of whatever anyone is doing, energy, because of climate change, and so on. So the government is very directly involved. Tax systems can actually provide all sorts of incentives. The way the labour markets work is also a government diktat, if you like, because of the way in which things develop. And we've seen some of the debates that are going on right now. So to even argue that government can have a hands-off approach to this is unrealistic at present. And it's particularly unrealistic given the huge task that we have to face ahead in terms of ensuring that the economy grows again. And the government has a role to play in all this, given that it can actually provide the right incentives. But that is the short term. In the short term, we definitely want growth, and we want faster growth to ensure that we don't suddenly end up with huge unemployment increasing again. Remember, unemployment, for those of you still employed, is a lagging indicator. In other words, in a year of declining growth might actually mean that possibly by the time of the next election, unemployment is rising again, and that, of course, will be a disaster. But we should really worry much more about the medium and long term. And there is a growth commission which has been set up at the LSE, the London School of Economics, to look at this, and is reporting pretty soon. But there is an interesting aspect in this, which I think will define perhaps the way in which the government works in the future. There's been a new look at environmental and quality of life indicators, which are throwing up a number of rather interesting questions for economists and policymakers alike. Do we feel certain we know enough? I've just given you various sort of indicators of what's going to be happening in the economy, but do we know enough about what, in fact, is going on? Are we gathering the right data? Are we measuring the right things? And is there something really wrong, just following on the previous speaker, with the way in which the economy expanded in the previous few decades, particularly the growth of the financial sector, which has sown the seeds for only slow growth in the future that we have to perhaps get used to ourselves here? And Professor Tony Atkinson, in his presentation to that commission at the London School of Economics, referred to a study in 2009 by Stiglitz, held by Zen and Fitoussi, which had set up a commission which recommended, amongst other things, that the output measure of GDP, in other words, the way in which we calculate whether activity is going up or down, needs to take into account inequality, and particularly the impact on disposable incomes as a result of whatever other forces there may be in the economy, which might be a much more accurate measure of material well-being than just production, how many cars are perhaps coming out per year. And he followed the recommendation of that commission by suggesting that measures should include distribution data as part of the overall GDP measure, gross domestic product measure, rather than just be provided in isolation on the side as an interesting sort of side product. And his conclusions were that if you adjust growth by inequality, you have a very different story about long-term growth in the economy, and also how you compare yourself to other countries. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has also done work along those lines, and they also think that there should be measures in the national accounts focusing more on household income and its distribution. So this is clearly a very big agenda that needs addressing. And I think this is quite interesting, because we're looking back at the US, for example, and thinking that it actually had a rather good period since the war. If you look at it in more detail, you realize that during the boom years, people have now come to comprehend that in that country, median incomes hardly rose in the past 30 years. And the benefits from increased wealth seem to have gone mostly to the top 1% of the population. And why does it matter? It matters because the wealthy spend a smaller percentage of their incomes on local goods and services. Funds move abroad much more easily. They don't use public services as much, and therefore don't really care about whether they're particularly good. They're indifferent to their quality. So the way in which income is distributed could also affect tax collection. Look at the furor over big companies not paying tax right now, but also what has been going on with a richer part of the population here. So if you take that into account, you might actually find a very different picture being shown to us. And that needs to be understood. So in reality, there is a role to play for the government, first of all, to understand this better. Second, to adjust this type of inequality and distribution to ensure more sustainable growth in the years ahead. Thank you.
Mike.
Okay, good afternoon. Capitalism, kill or cure? Well, capitalism is an economic system based on private ownership of the means of production, the creation of goods or services for profit. It implies a competitive marketplace and formally or informally contracted labor or skills. So in itself, it's neither inherently good nor bad. It's merely an economic system. In fact, since the fall of the Soviet Union, few have talked about not having capitalism at all, but there are many models around and many different varieties. And of course, We are in the middle of a huge economic downturn, and many of the countries that are suffering from the economic downturn do in fact have capitalist systems. So people are arguing about whether the downturn is triggered by lack of regulation or perhaps even not free enough markets. But I would argue it's actually not about capitalism. It's not about regulation. It's about the nature of business and the perspective of business leaders. In fact, we need a better culture of behavior within capitalism, a culture that goes beyond the contract my colleague on the right has mentioned. But there's nothing really new in this. Ted Heath talked about the unacceptable face of capitalism back in the 70s. David Cameron has talked about moral capitalism. Even Ed Miliband has talked about producer versus predator companies. So I want to talk about the culture of kindness. And there's a need for the capitalist structure to encourage companies that are kind. Now, this is not sloppy sentimentalism. Kind businesses are those that work to optimize total shareholder return over the long term, but they do so for the common good in what they produce, how they respect and treat their customers, consumers, and how they treat their employees. Kind companies see the world as a win-win. They know business is tough, markets are highly competitive and challenging, and that you have to be clever to win, but it cannot be at the expense of society. Now, they recognize that winning in these times, however, requires a different approach. The marketplace is no longer just a place where by having good quality, low price, and good service, you're going to win the day. Because the right to trade is no longer automatic and is being challenged across all sectors. In short, kind companies recognize that they will only be successful if others benefit from their actions, and they see customer satisfaction, employee excitement, and social endorsement as indicators of the long-term viability of their business. So society's expectations of how companies behave and operate are becoming much more clearly defined and more vocally expressed. Societal opinion is more evident and pronounced more freely than ever before. Because people worry. People worry about their health. They worry about the safety and security of their children and their families. People are rejecting abuse, corruption, and fraud. There's a revulsion from those who take from society and do not provide true value in return. The collective voice is heard loudly and communicated swiftly. Governments are increasingly listening to public opinion and maybe even pandering to it. Businesses are learning that an unhappy society leads to tighter regulation. So, however, kind companies have recognized that not only can they be financially successful by focusing on the benefits they provide and the good they do, but increasingly they will be successful only if they conduct their business that way. And it's not about being soft or signing corporate social investment checks, but about truly embracing the concepts of a kind business into your corporate culture, your strategies, and the way you operate. Vicious companies, on the other hand, and I'll put companies such as Lehman Brothers into this bracket, are focused only on short-term goals, win at all costs. They pursue profit without consideration of the potentially damaging impact of their actions. The CEO seeks personal gain without concern for the value he adds. They push operations to the legal edge and rely on using their might and power in the courtroom. They see little obligation to their customer, to society, or their local community for the role they play and the way they play it. And it's only by encouraging the development of kind businesses that we can best invoke a new era of societally acceptable capitalism. Some of you may feel that it's really a role of government to ensure that corporate entities behave this way. But a culture of kindness can only come from within and cannot be regulated from without. Now, I've worked in seven companies in 6 countries and 3 continents looking for a company that I feel is kind and will suit the approach I want. And I spent the last 24 years with the brewing company SABMiller. a company that's thrived globally from the unregulated markets of Africa through to the highly regulated UK and the US. We were born out of Africa. We've grown to being the second largest brewer in the world. We've achieved that not by being separate from society or by taking advantage of the lack of regulation where it's such the case, but by recognizing that our success is inextricably linked to the well-being support of the communities in which we serve. And that's why I stay with this company all this time. So, as I said before, it's not about being soft. I've personally led major retrenchment programs in organizations I've run. We provided soft landings for our employees through retraining or reskilling. So there's always a way to limit the pain. And the company's not perfect. None are. But the inherent aspiration is to be kind, and this aspiration comes from the top leadership down. It cannot work without that. So if we can get not only companies, but government and NGOs to be kind, success will come regardless of the economic system that prevails. Thank you.
Phil.
Thanks. These are very odd times, I think, to discuss the pros and cons of capitalism, especially for someone of my generation, because if I were able to go back 25, 30 years, nice thing to do, but if I were able to do that, back to the 1980s, say, and if I were able to look forward from the 1980s to today and to see the economic mess which exists across the Western world, then I think then I would have anticipated two things. Firstly, I would have anticipated that if capitalism was still surviving, as it obviously would be, as we know, then anti-capitalism would have still been a minority viewpoint. Because if it wasn't a minority viewpoint, then capitalism would have been replaced by something else. Secondly, I would have anticipated, if we were in this mess, that I would have been in the forefront of blaming the economic problems on the crisis tendencies inherent within capitalism. Actually, looking at both those anticipations, ironically, they are very far from being the case. Take the first one. Is anti-capitalism a minority viewpoint? I'd say far from it. I think anti-capitalism is pretty much the dominant viewpoint today. I think it's the dominant viewpoint, the mainstream view, and it stretches right from the people demonstrating on the streets today to the Occupy protesters last year to the governing elites, to the White House and to Number 10 and to the Élysée Palace and so on. Because it seems just about everyone is an anti-capitalist now, is quite happy to bemoan capitalism's economic and moral failings, quite happy to blame today's malaise on the greed of capitalism and on the excesses of the banking system. That is a very common, dominant viewpoint. The conservative American writer, Charles Murray, recently published a book called Coming Apart, The State of White America. He summarized this mainstream perspective by saying that capitalism has a serious image problem, is the way he described it. And he describes, correctly I think, that to be called a capitalist these days is an accusation, pretty much a term of abuse. He describes the way those waves of creative destruction that Ferdinand commented on, those periodic renewals of capitalism's ability to generate new value, the thing which Joseph Schumpeter in the middle of last century said were the essence of capitalism and of its dynamic potential. Those waves of creative destruction these days are seen as a problem, if not, to use Charles Murray's words, as seen as downright evil. So I think anti-capitalism and sort of an unease with capitalism is the dominant point of view. The second part of the irony for me, anticipating what I would be doing in this in the midst of this crisis, is that as someone who believes that, as I did, reading 3 volumes of Marx's Capital remains key influential intellectual influence for me, I find myself yet again in a minority, this time in not being able to identify with this new anti-capitalist temper of our times. And for me, the irony, the incongruity, is that at a time when more people than ever are negative about capitalism as a system, it is a time when capitalism's inherent tendencies to crisis are, I think, only indirectly responsible for the mess we're in, or only responsible at several steps remove. For me, today's contained depression, this long period of muddling along of the sort of recessionary tendencies which Vicky has reminded us of, and in last week's IMF report again, a pretty grim outlook. That contained depression is, I think, much less a crisis of the intrinsic crisis tendencies of capitalism and much more a crisis or a failure of politics, much more of an intellectual or a subjective failure, much more something which expresses itself as a lack of political purpose. One expression of that, I think, is the reluctance which exists today amongst the different national elites to do what is necessary to overhaul, restructure, renew capitalism, because that is what would be necessary in order to get out of the hole that we're in. Instead, we see this endless scenario of, as in the title of my book, of just muddling along and just hoping that things will somehow not get too much worse. Now, the root of this failure, I would say, is an important cultural shift which has taken place, which is that as a society, we've become very reluctant to validate or promote the active, positive side of humanity in being able to change things for a better. On the contrary, whenever things are changed, we tend to always look at the worst. We tend to see progress as being problematic. And that's a very important cultural shift which has taken place. And I think it's that is a symptom of the way that we become overly wary of the uncertainties which are inevitably associated with progress, the disruptiveness of innovation. And I think that it's that cultural shift, is what I'm arguing, which is key in appreciating today's mood of anti-capitalism. Because unlike the anti-capitalism of old, it is not about challenging or exposing capitalism's inability to develop the productive forces, to develop productivity, but it's much more about being put off by capitalism's association with dynamism and expansion and the inevitable dislocation that goes with those phenomena. To return to Murray's image problem, I think my argument is that society has become very uncomfortable with the image capitalism is traditionally associated with. An image of being expansionary, an image of business cycles, an image of periodic bouts of economic restructuring and renewal, an image of boom and bust. And the irony of that uncomfortableness with the way capitalism is perceived and why people distance themselves from it is that, of course, we have a capitalism which is very far from being dynamic or very far from being expansionary. So to conclude, paradoxically, therefore, I'd argue that it is today's mainstream anti-capitalism, the unease with capitalism, much more than capitalism itself, which is holding us back from a return to some decent level of economic prosperity. The biggest challenge today arises less from the result of capitalism's inherent tendencies to crisis and are much more the result of the lack of political purpose and of our political culture of muddling along and just hoping fatalistically that things don't get too much worse.
Ferdy, if you could just, when you were explaining that the problem today is really the breaking of contracts, the breaches of trust, the pension fund looting. For me, listening to that, I suppose the question that goes begging is, what brought that on then? You know, why didn't they have their hand in the till before?
It took a long time for them to realize that they could do it, and then the pressures built up on them to do it even more. The quarterly reports of asset managers designed to show that you're going places, the rewards for short-term performance, all these things built up a fresh set of pressures, which I don't think had been there in the early years. But as I say, I think the pressures can work in the other direction. I was very struck by Mike's word kind, which, I wouldn't have dared to use, but he, having lifetime's experience in big business, is fully entitled to. And I think you see the expectations are changing daily. For example, in the paper this morning, there was a cry of indignation that Sainsbury's were telling their suppliers that they were going to pay in 90 days instead of 30 days, which they had been up till now, which of course is curtains for many small suppliers who've got huge bank loans to pay. Conversely, Rolls-Royce was indignant that the banks weren't lending more and that they, Rolls-Royce, were having to finance some of their small suppliers to keep going. But these are kindness either sought or achieved, which is a kind of, these are news stories which wouldn't have made news a few years ago. People are really taking an interest in the culture within business, in a way that didn't happen. And when Ted Heath, as you were saying, said the unacceptable face of capitalism, he was hooted down within the Tory party. You know, if someone saying that today would say, yes, of course there's an unacceptable face.
So if I can bring you into that, Mike, I mean, do you recognise any of the problem that Phil's trying to outline? I suppose it's a version of what I'm asking Ferdy as well. Is it, you know, might there be something wrong with the system underneath, or is it just a matter of bad behaviour that we can clean up through new codes of behaviour or regulation?
I think maybe it's a problem of condoning bad behaviour. And I think the bad behaviour of the banks, to a large degree, was condoned and allowed. And within the banks themselves, there was a knowledge that the instruments they were working on were, in fact, corrupt. So there was throughout the industry, there was a kind of Jimmy Savile approach to life of cover-up. And I think this is where issues lie. I think one of the trends that we are seeing as things are going forward now is that it's harder and harder to cover up, and that people are demanding, and that, you know, the tweets and Twitters and the social media ability to raise objection on a massive scale is unprecedented. So people can perceive abuse and perceive error, raise a huge amount of support very quickly and bring it to the attention of authorities. And there are many NGOs who are active in many areas who are raising questions which may, on the face of it, sound ridiculous. But when you dig in, they may be on the basis of a real concern. So I think the way in which society is changing is an ability for the ordinary person who used not to have a voice to now have a voice and to now be heard, and be heard at the highest circles, which I think is a good thing. The only thing I think is a bad thing is when the only answer is regulation.
Quite often those voices that are raised inevitably say, help me out, I deserve some kind of protection.
And maybe they're right, and I think that there are people who have genuine complaint. And an advantage of this ability to raise voice is that if you have a genuine complaint, you can be heard. And of course, there's always the judgment process that goes on. Is the issue real or not real? But what we've found in areas where we've opened up our websites, for example, to chatter, is that the community at large is often self-regulating. That we hear people that come onto our websites with comments that are quite extreme, and we don't have to react. Somebody else will. And so there's a kind of moderating voice in society that really, as more and more people talk and get engaged, the moderation becomes more real. The extremists have less of a voice because more people get involved.
Okay, Vicky, there's just one thing I wanted to clarify, a point about inequality and marrying that up with the measures of GDP. Because certainly, yes, you can look at US wages post-war and show that period. But it sort of depends which period you pick, right? Because if you pick the 1950s and the 1960s, as Kennedy said, everybody was rising together. It seems that it's in decline, that there is a lowering down of wages and an increase in inequality. So I suppose what I want to push you on is, are you saying we should accept that as a new normal, that we just get used to less growth, which is a sort of new economics foundation argument, or is there any possibility of generating new growth and then we could narrow that gap in inequality again?
Well, yes, no, I'm looking at the second aspect of that, because we have to be optimistic and we do need to ensure that also all our children are able to find jobs and continue to prosper. So I think there is we owe it, I think, to the next generation to ensure we get growth. But my point is that the way in which particularly austerity measures have been imposed have increased inequalities in all those countries, and hence the social contract thing that I mentioned before. But also if you look at what's been going on in the developed countries, and this inequality that has arisen, there is an issue about whether that in itself, and there's a lot of work being done by economists right now, whether that in itself actually adds and encourages more volatility and crisis to happen in the economy. On the one hand, you could argue that the more unequal the economy is, the more money is actually held in the hands of the rich. There's more savings in the economy because basically they don't spend as much as the rest, and that gets reinvested in productive capacity. On the other hand, there are other people who argue that if the opposite is the case and more money is perhaps more equally distributed, then at least the majority of people who make those decisions through some sort of equilibrium will perhaps invest it better. So the argument isn't settled about whether the inequality issue is a seriously important one or not in terms of economic growth, but it looks as if it is moving towards actually suggesting that with volatility and crisis happening, you get a destruction in productive capacity and in particularly in people remaining unemployed and not working at the skill level, a destruction in skills, which makes countries like ours and the US overall sort of less competitive in the long term, and therefore it needs to be addressed. That's basically what the argument is. So what you can do, and actually it makes a lot of common sense, frankly, is look at how you can overcome that and ensure there's faster growth by ensuring that you do this horizontal stuff. The government is very instrumental in this, such as ensuring that skills and education levels are right, ensuring that there isn't regulatory protection of powerful industries, encourage innovation and entrepreneurship through a sort of proper and fair financial and education system, and much greater transparency, the type of stuff we've just been hearing, and corporate governance in firms, so that restores confidence in the business sector. And I have a slight disagreement with what has been said before in terms of kind companies and not kind companies. There is a serious business reason for why companies need to worry about corporate social responsibility and why they perhaps occasionally support their suppliers, which actually was always the case in the past. It is because they want them to keep on providing the stuff that they need. They squeeze them in terms of prices a lot, but they need to keep them going. Otherwise, they're going to have a problem in terms of producing the final goods. And why are supermarkets not paying in time? In fact, when I was working for the government, we had managed to make loads of them sign up to actually paying in 30 days. And it's extraordinary if that has turned around. It suggests to me that profit margins are being squeezed. And who is to blame at the end of the day? We have to take responsibility for this ourselves. The shareholders who put all this pressure on returns and profits. The shareholders are institutional investors who basically are looking after our pension funds at a time of low interest rates. That's the only way in which they can get some better returns. So I think we're all in it.
Phil, I think you're ending up in sort of the unkind capitalist chair, or are you? I mean, are you saying that there should be go for broke with growth, or?
Yes, I am, but I think don't brand me as somebody in favour of unkind or irresponsible capitalism. What I'm getting at, I think, is responding to these comments about the lapses in the sort of fairness and the cultural problems within the way business operates. So I think we need to put a bit of historical perspective on this, because the way you're describing it, and presumably both Mike and Ferdinand relating it in some way as being an underpinning cause for the malaise that we're in today, is that somehow there was a golden age before the 2000s or before the 1980s or before whenever, when capitalism was and business was responsible and a very kind and fair process and system. I mean, there are no statistics which show that there has been a secular shift into unfairness or into unkindness. There's many statistics which show that people have less trust in business. The perception is certainly the case, and I'm sure you're right, Ferdinand, or you are definitely right. There's many more media stories about it. There's, it becomes news much more if there's a lapse in boardroom practice. But the idea that the pre-2000s capitalism was fair and kind, and it's that which has been the shift which causes the problems today, is I think, clearly false. I mean, in many, many ways, and several of us on the platform have been involved in the business over the last 30 years and so, perhaps some longer, the secular trend has been in the opposite direction in terms of more responsible business. I mean, look back, 130 years ago, the robber barons. I mean, what they got up to, what the J.P. Morgans and the Carnegies and the Rockefellers got up to, and what the similar fellow travellers of theirs got up to in the 1930s in the crisis then, I think, pales the activity today into insignificance. So the idea that somehow it is a behavioural problem or it is a cultural problem in the outlook of the individual capitalist which is at fault, I think mystifies what is going on today. I think it belittles the scale of the challenges which the economy's got. Because what you're really arguing for, and you're taking a stance, I can see, against regulation, but just sort of some educational improvement of behaviour and making businesses, kinder through some sort of awareness-raising process. To think that will somehow get us out of the mess that we're in today, I think is to put it mildly, a bit wishful thinking.
And I think the trend is towards more kindness, to be honest with you. I think there are some remarkable exceptions, and the banking industry, I would say, has been through a crisis of confidence and needs to restore it. Certainly, as industry and business used to be many years ago, was not in the direction I'm talking. I think we're getting better.
Perhaps we need to separate out the banking crash from the inequality which had begun to accelerate before that crash, and the search for growth. Sine qua non, before we get down to thinking how we do it, is to accept that when all the actors in the economy are broke and have high levels of debt, the return to growth is bound to be slow and painful.
Almost the most interesting thing to me about the whole debate so far is that you're all in favour of capitalism, aren't you? You've all come out and defended it, and what you've said is you could modify it, but you shouldn't change it. You shouldn't go anywhere near the S word, which no one mentioned, socialism. And the other thing that you didn't do, and has been curiously sort of absent from any debate in the media recently, especially around Cameron's idea on what you could do to regulate gas prices. Everyone said you can't do this. Well, you can. You can nationalise gas supply. You can nationalise energy companies. You can nationalise utilities. You can nationalise the railways. And you could still do that and have some form of capitalism. We've done that before.
I was very interested to hear the suggestion that JP Morgan's behaviour in the 1930s was an example of unkind capitalism, because based on everything I've read about both that crisis and the more recent one, the reason why JP Morgan is still in business, and its principal competitor at the time, a firm called Kuhn Loeb, which was later merged into Lehman Brothers, is because while they may not have been kind, JP Morgan was persistently engaged in honourable capitalism. JP Morgan might well foreclose on a house and throw a single mother and her children into the streets in the middle of winter, but they would not lie about it, and they would not do it if they didn't actually own the mortgage, and it wasn't actually behind schedule, and they'd made an honest attempt to work it out. And they would never even think of false accounting or of systematically trying to manipulate LIBOR. And I think this whole issue goes back to the issue about social contracts, and particularly the social contracts between business and society that Francis mentioned. And I think, in a sense, a focus on kindness and whether CEOs help little old ladies across the road and donate money to support... and I understand what you're saying, is that, but that possibly kind is the wrong word to use, and some concept like honest or honourable might be more descriptive.
I wanted to say something about the discussion of inequality that Vicky raised, and I think there were quite a few misconceptions there. First of all, I'd preface any discussion by saying that if you have some kind of government report commissioned by the government, which isn't doing very well in promoting economic growth, and the conclusion of the report is that, well, growth is not that important, you should at least treat those results sceptically. It doesn't prove that they're wrong. That was certainly true in the case of the report that Vicky mentioned, where you had Nicolas Sarkozy in France, when he was president, commissioning this report, getting an economist, an old Clinton administration political functionary, Joe Stiglitz, to chair the commission. And then they come to the conclusion, surprise, surprise, growth is not that important. Like I said, it doesn't prove they're wrong. But if you look at the record of economic growth in the 80s, 90s, and running up to the crisis, it was actually pretty poor. What you had was not strong growth and widening inequality. What you had was poor growth, particularly in the real economy and real innovation, and widening inequality. And in fact, you can make a strong case, and I haven't really got time to go into it here, you can make a strong case that the two were related, because poor growth in the real economy was very closely related to widening asset prices, share prices going up, and that 1% who everyone talks about, they were the people who make most of the money from share options and rising asset prices. So in fact, widening inequality and poor growth went together. They weren't contradicting each other. And finally, to conclude, the conclusion that is drawn from this in the political mainstream is that what this inequality shows is that we need shared sacrifice. So the conclusion is not that we should take society forward, we should have more progress, more growth, which I would think would be a very good thing. The conclusion is this very dodgy, romantic, anti-capitalist conclusion that all of us need to make sacrifices, all of us need to accept that we should be worse off, and it's not at all a positive discussion.
One of the issues that the panel didn't really consider was looking at the problems of capitalism as a whole. You've really come at it from within the system. But if you look at capitalism as a method of allocating resources, a market economy, then one of the fundamental problems of that is it's the poor people. If you don't have money, you're not a player. You can't express your demands. And so inherent in capitalism is inequality. So how do we, I'd just like your comments and observations on that.
On the subject of the 1% rich people in the US, I think further analysis shows that this 1% is not static. Most of it is dynamic. That is, there are people who come from the lower incomes and get to that very high percentage of 1% income. And an article I recently read, written by an American financial journalist, was making the point that, yes, probably that 1% is quite low, but the idea is to try and maintain and strengthen the opportunities for the actual lower income classes to be able to rise higher up. And on the point of kindness and social responsibility, obviously that's not a new one. For the last decade or more, corporates increasingly emphasize the good work they do within the communities, and that's right. And on the point of regulation, anti-regulation, otherwise the train of capitalism can get derailed. But the question I would like to ask the panel is it possible perhaps Western capitalism is not aggressive enough within the regulatory and social responsibility framework always, isn't aggressive enough. That's why Eastern capitalism of different forms perhaps is gaining ground.
Phil, you implied it was more of a subjective than an objective situation. But if I went outside London, I sense that capitalism is in a bit of a mess in England, more than you've implied. I mean, a lot of suburban towns, the only things that seem to be opening are charity shops, and the only ones getting a refit are charity shops. I know, is that just something that's going on because people are shopping on the internet, or is there something objective going on? Ferdinand, are you just saying we need a new word for it? Because talking about contracts made me think that you would like to say we live in a contractualist society rather than a capitalist. But the way it goes, it's just like you want to say that everybody's naughty, and so that if we stop being naughtiest, it'll all be okay. I couldn't follow whether you're saying again that there's a problem. Mike, kindness. Would you advise, say you were the King of Spain in 1492, would you tell Columbus you've given permission to go and discover, if you couldn't get that guarantee, that he's going to be kind? Because isn't there a sense that we need to take risks and perhaps not know what the consequences are going to be?
Yeah, a more specific question. Are the banks redeemable? I mean, it's just one scandal after another. One week it's manipulation of LIBOR. Next week it's setting aside even more, hundreds of millions of pounds for mis-selling of products, as with Barclays this week. I mean, the new chief executive was actually responsible for that specific area. The FSA has totally failed and has now been absorbed into the Bank of England. And there's great doubts that the next governor will have the qualities designed to cope with all this. He'll have to be an absolute Superman. Now we've got Paul Volcker actually pouring doubt over figures as to the splitting of retail banking and casino banking. Where are we headed?
Well, I have a question in relation to the point that Phil was talking about, the political and cultural situation that we're in. Because on the one hand, you say that society is uncomfortable with capitalist expansion, and you said that people see the disruptiveness of innovation as problematic. And I'm having trouble marrying that with the fact that somebody on the panel said these days everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, and that's certainly the case in the US. And in fact, if you look at all of the major institutions in the US, all of the major higher educational institutions, even law schools are developing centers of business entrepreneurship So my question is how you manage the fact that now everybody sees themselves as an entrepreneur and wants to be an entrepreneur, or if you're a lawyer, you want to provide legal services for entrepreneurs, but at the same time people are uncomfortable with, with innovation. Or are you saying that because of the political and cultural climate that we're in, the content of being an entrepreneur has changed?
The question on the various commissions and what they've come up with, can I say that I actually agreed with almost absolutely everything that this person's, the chap's question with in the checked shirt was. You're quite right that the worst thing that can possibly happen and has happened is people say, we're measuring the wrong thing and therefore, we've been doing quite well after all. And you're absolutely right, that should not happen. And in fact, I raised it as an issue. Are we in fact measuring the right thing? And that is an issue, since things get revised all the time and we may not be. But my conclusion wasn't at all about equal sacrifices for all. It was quite the opposite. Because you can take, as an analyst, as an economist, you can take things that come from all sorts of sort of pieces of evidence, but then actually look at how do you get bigger growth in the future, which I think is a very good thing. And that is by ensuring that there are things in society which actually allow for that to happen, which means that, in fact, if anything, you're spreading a lot more the opportunities to people, and you're rethinking, if you like, some of the financial system structures to ensure there is access and transparency in terms of what is around, which allows entrepreneurs and everyone else to grow. But the skills issue, in my view, being one of the most important one, and not allowing vested interests, picking winners, that sort of thing, which I think is really, really wrong, because basically it's the ones that shout loudest and are most successful who tend to get benefits given to them, and then they keep competition out from everyone else. So there are lessons to be drawn if you're looking at some of the evidence that's coming out, which puts you into a faster growth path again in the future, but a more equal one. So it's not sacrifices, but it's positive.
Perfect. Phil?
On the inequality question, firstly, just to give a quick plug to Ferdinand's book, The New View, because Ferdinand a couple of times makes the very straightforward point, which often gets forgotten about this, and I think was alluded to up there in the audience, which is that the period when inequality narrowed was, of course, during the post-war years. It was economic growth that led to a narrowing, and I think you make the complementary point, it wasn't even tax rises which redistributed things. Taxes fell during that period as well. So the lesson from that is that the way to deal with inequality and widening inequality is to get back to a growing economy, and that's what we're lacking at the moment. When I was saying that the problem, I think, is more anti-capitalism than capitalism, I wasn't in any way saying that capitalism was somehow working well and we didn't have to worry about it. The point I was making was that capitalism is in a very moribund condition, not just in the outskirts, around the provinces, in London too, and even in the United States, this entrepreneurial capital of the centre of the world. Capitalism is in a very bad state. What I'm saying is that what we need to focus on in order to get out of that mess is to recognise that it's not just those sort of objective tendencies which have falling profitability, which were dominant in the 1970s and the 1980s. Today, I think that's trumped by this cultural lapse, this lack of actually recognising that what we're having is not too much capitalism, but not enough of the fruits of capitalism. To come to the point, to tie this up with the comment about entrepreneurship, I mean, one could be cynical and say, entrepreneurship is a euphemism for the self-employed, and it's, if you can't get a job, you rebrand yourself as an entrepreneur. Clearly, there are people who are approaching it in a more progressive way than that. But I think the reality is that we live in despite appearances, we live in a Western world which is very much lacking in innovation. People have a perception that everything is changing very fast, very tumultuous, turbocharged capitalism. But more and more stuff and material is coming out now, which I share, which actually says we live in a very non-innovative period. Okay. There's stuff like Tyler Cowen's book on the Great Stagnation, or Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal. Both say that really nothing has happened in terms of innovation in the last 20, 30 years, apart from what I mentioned earlier, the internet. And comparing that to earlier phases of capitalism, capitalism is a very, very moribund system. My focus was, how do we get out of that?
Ferdy.
Paul Volcker, as far as I can understand, says Vickers doesn't go far enough, that we should go back to the Glass-Steagall system of a complete separation between investment banks and high street banks. And I think that would be a very good thing. That would clear the minds of all people concerned as to what a particular bank is for, which has been the great conclusion. I mean, I think there are things which are straightforward. They do fall to government, and the fact that we have been saying that things have got to come from within business doesn't mean that nothing has to come from government, and nor, to answer the question at the top there, are we as scared as all that of the S word? Because 40% of our national life is already effectively socialized, and whether it goes up a little, as one party would say, or down a little, as the other party would say, is a matter of debate. But we're not frightened of governments doing things, regulating things where we feel that needs to happen. Just, sorry, I won't know, because I won't go on equality.
I think we'll bring it back in to Mike.
I think kindness is not about CEOs taking old ladies across the road. It's about not selling a mortgage to somebody who clearly does not have the money and will no doubt be in dire stress in 1 or 2 years' time. So I think it's the way you approach the work rather than what you do. It's the way in which you deliver your goods and the way you treat society and the way you do that. Sure, business has to be highly competitive, and that is what makes it strong, because business is run by people who have been doing what they do for many, many years and are very skilled. I struggle to understand how handing a business over to government is going to make that any better. I struggle to understand how the training, development, growth, the ambition, the risk is going to still be there when you put businesses under government control. The whole ethos of industry is the ability to grow, the ability to build more plant, produce more goods, sell more goods overseas, bring in more capital, employ more people, provide more futures for more families, and all together to build a hope for people around the world. That's what business does.
Thank you. Yeah, in fact, picking up on that exact point with the... I want to sort of reiterate something or suggest something to the two speakers at the end there, who I massively agree with, actually, on this point of what's been described as kind capitalism, or many other ways. Don't we as citizens, much like government, get the capitalism we deserve, in that actually one of the things we maybe don't realise is how much power we have to actually affect and change this. Businesses are massively, massively rational in their behaviours. And if we make choices as consumers, that will affect their behaviours. One of the interesting things about the late 20th century is we seem to have almost aggregated that responsibility to government, expecting that they're going to make good decisions and protect us from evil capital. And the more we do that, aren't we actually taking even less control for ourselves? Isn't, perversely, this potentially quite an exciting century for capitalism if we as consumers start, as the two gentlemen were suggesting at the far end there, making rational choices ourselves and making real choices about the kind of businesses we support and take a part in. And so, as I say, isn't it potentially quite exciting times for capitalism ahead?
I have a question for Mike. Could you be more specific about what the sort of actions that kindness underpins, and also how you capture in measuring the kindness in a business environment where the leadership is obsessed with measurable KPIs, targets? How do you monitor and manage kindness?
We are, I think, quantifying the wrong thing. When we look at what we're trying to get out of this, it's human happiness. When we look at it solely through the level of economic prosperity, we define what human beings are and what they want. It turns out that's quite incorrect. We're discussing ultimately here matters of human psychology. And the research from psychology is unequivocal. Being rich does not make you happy. Up to a certain level of, you're not starving, all the other factors of humanity become far more important. And so to bankrupt the world and its resources and the other things mentioned, it's a profound mistake to think this is purely a question of economics. It's a human question.
Two quick questions. One, it seems obvious to me this is a crisis of capitalism. This is an unsustainable expansion of credit in all sectors of the economy, and now we've got debt. And this is a pattern that's been repeated throughout capitalism. The problem now is we don't really have an alternative model of how we get the food in Sainsbury's, etc.
So we're stuck with a system of crisis, but we've got no alternative means of running the economy. And the second question is, are we really talking just about Europe and America? There are parts of the world where the growth is quite substantial. And what are the reasons for that? And what does the panel think about that?
Two gentlemen on the right, I wholeheartedly wish I could agree with you that business moralism is the way forward. But I think within the current framework, the systemic framework which allows businesses and banks to operate the way they do, this is absolute blue sky thinking. I mean, thank you, Starbucks, that you use fair trade coffee beans, but that's not going to solve unemployment issues. So the question I have is, how do we implant this communitarian business approach? How are we going to do this? And this relates also to the question of self-interest, because if we create a system which expands self-interest to the community, is that possible?
I just want to first disagree with the thesis that capitalism has an image problem. If anything, the protest movements have shown that they want more capitalism and not less. One of the slogans of the Indignados movements was, we are not against the system is against us. So they want to hold capitalism to its promise for more prosperity for everyone. I think, however, that the protest has been against a certain kind of capitalism, and this is that because already before the crisis, capitalism had changed as risk and opportunities were no longer correlated in the way in an ideal market society should be. So the state, as Angus invited us to talk about the role of the state had become an actor to support certain capitalists, like big companies, financial capital. So we were living already by the turn of the century in a state of a kind of a post-neoliberal capitalism, which in my writings I have called aggregative capitalism, that the state helps certain actors to be the strong capitalist against capitalism itself.
I'm surprised at a discussion on capitalism and the current crisis, and we're talking about GDP and growth, but not once have I heard one word, which is the word inflation. And I'm just wondering that, inflation is like a secret tax on individuals and businesses, and basically part of that is created by the way high street banks create the money in the form of loans that they give to us and then expect us to pay interest on. How can we have a system where we grow and where things get better when we still have this system where we have so much inflation to deal with?
I would like some further explanation of your word kindness, because I was perplexed by the example you gave of not giving a loan to somebody who needed a house and that you would turn them away, and that could be interpreted as kindness. I wouldn't want to think that marketing departments had taken over the English language, and indeed the use of a very important word in our language, kindness. A Quaker company would indeed, and the communities I come from in Suffolk, would have built a home for that worker who needed a mortgage that you thought it was not kind to give them. Does kindness in SABMiller mean more than a marketing slogan? Or would you be prepared to build a house for that homeless person? Because the communities I came from would.
The discussion on the panel ended with the comment that capitalism means needing more, so more production, more consumption, etc. But it seems to me that the problem of always wanting more, and that some points along this line have been made over there already, that always wanting more is the problem essentially that's got us into this mess. More production, more loans, the constant need for growth. And I'm wondering whether the panel think that our economy can really keep growing forever, which is an idea that seems odd to me. We're constantly asking why we aren't still growing, but surely there must eventually come a point where we can't just grow and grow and grow. And also whether our environment and our society as human beings can really sustain constantly striving for more and increased growth and increased production. Does there not come a point where we have to stop?
Why in this debate is about capitalism is the most extreme forms you can get. Either seems to be letting companies do what they want with very low state intervention, or very high state intervention, say Why aren't there talks about, let's say, abolishing the state altogether, and maybe a society that doesn't need money or things like that, instead of, in one of the most high debated things, it just seems to be very limited scope.
I think one of the problems in achieving more kindness in capitalism is precisely the role of the state in regulation. When the lady says she thinks that government is afraid of business and stays clear of it, I tell you, after 30 years of a corporate lawyer, that's not true. They're spending a huge amount of their energy in compliance. They're spending an awful lot of time in compliance. And the problem with all this regulation is not whether the regulation's right or wrong, it's the costs of compliance, which creates a huge barrier for entry so that you can't get lots of new companies. And if you want lots of rapid, responsive, kind, accountable to the community businesses, you want lots of small businesses. And even in Britain, where the big businesses dominate, they're still generating much of the employment in the small business sector. And the small business sector is winding down. It's on strike at the moment. Many members of my family were in it, and they're backing out of it because the costs of compliance, they say to themselves, we're just working for the government, we're not working for anybody else.
I wondered whether the panel thought there was any way of measuring things that were socially useful rather than GDP. I have problems with the whole idea of measuring human happiness. First, because people who develop, for example, life-saving drugs aren't necessarily happy about it, but certainly they might feel satisfied afterwards. I think the second problem, which I'd like to also raise with the happiness concept and also about more, is the idea that more Prada bags might not be socially useful, but certainly more life-saving drugs or more wind farms might be socially useful, and we probably want more of those things.
I'd just like to say to the various speakers who've questioned whether we need more and more growth, just the idea that growth doesn't mean more and more, it means more and different. To take, for example, my own industry, newspapers, there will be whole forests standing in the future as a result of newspapers on newsprint dying and transferring to the web. There are thousands of examples of where growth means not only benefit, but it means qualitative change. And I think when one goes for a no-growth society, one needs to think about the consequences of that.
Perfect, thank you. Vicky?
Two quick points. One on the inflation thing. I did actually say that household incomes, and therefore the ones that are affected by inflation, need to be taken into consideration as a measure, if you like, of well-being. I have serious concerns about measuring well-being in any different way, because at the end of the day, people who are employed are the happiest ones that are around. So talking about no growth means basically lots of people being unemployed. And I'll give you one economic fact, which is that you need an advanced economy to grow by 2.5% per annum to account for sort of technological change, to be able to have a technological change that's required, just to keep employment constant. And we are currently in decline, as is quite a large part of the advanced world economy. So if you want, instead of what we have at present, loads of people unemployed and well-being actually dropping very substantially, then that's the way to go about it.
Mike?
Businesses drive development. Development drives competition. Competition drives innovation. Innovation drives the ability to deal with 9 billion people by the year 2070. Without business being active and competing, new products, processes, and capabilities would not be in place in time. As businesses grow, they compete. And as they grow, they earn more money. As they earn more money, they do invest in society. And for the lady on my left, you'd be surprised how much money does get invested into society by businesses in many, many different ways. And in fact, it's part of the scene, because if business does not do it, society objects, and the customers pull away their custom. So business is the essence by which the future will be managed.
Thanks, Mike. And Phil?
I think this discussion has, unfortunately, ducked the issues. When people said, we're in the worst crisis since the 1930s, everyone sort of nodded their heads and said, yeah, that's right. And that, I think the gravity of the situation hasn't really come through, that there is some big, big questions that we need to answer. And I think, we're all complicit, and I think the elites are complicit in a certain evasion of taking responsibility for the way things are. There's a Viennese saying, which I'm sure most of you will remember, which I think sort of afflicted a lot of the world, which is saying that the situation is hopeless but not serious. And that Viennese saying is a sort of an expression of the sort of fatalism which there is. Okay, we can't do anything about it. We're in the new normal. Things are going to be slow and sluggish for a long time. There won't be much of recovery, but, we can muddle through. I take the stance that we need to more advance the alternate saying from the Prussians and the Berliners, which is that the situation is serious but not hopeless. Because I think we have to challenge that fatalism, that there's very little that can be done, and actually see that a lot more is in our hands to change things for the better. And I think until people begin to grasp, the seriousness of the situation, the sort of statistics that Vicky and others were describing in terms of stagnating living standards, no sense of society moving forward in innovating or doing new things, until we grasp the seriousness of that, then we're really evading those challenges.
Okay, can we thank our panel?